Inflation is rising again, yet another ticking time bomb the Biden regime is handing Donald Trump. The Bureau of Labor Statistics, who tallies inflation, is out with new numbers showing both CPI and core CPI rising at an annualized 3.8%. That's up from under 1% just 6 months ago, and it takes the year-on-year to 2.7% inflation, which is about 40% above the Fed's alleged target. Now, for those following along at home, it's been over 3.5 years since Jerome Powell told us inflation was transitory. At some point, people might stop believing him. The worst of it, once again, is housing, up nearly 4% annualized, and food, up nearly 5% annualized. Gasoline was up 7.5% annualized. Note all that's with China dumping cheap imports ahead of potential Trump tariffs. So what's driving inflation's zombie return? In short, government spending and the money it creates. That's what launched Bidenflation. As COVID spending flooded the country to buy lockdowns, Jerome Powell's hikes took the edge off strangling the private sector to clear the highway for government spending. But once those hikes started taking down banks last year, Jerome panicked and eased off the hikes. Meanwhile, Jerome also slashed Fed's Treasury sales, so-called quantitative tightening. Since deficits were so large, there were fears that nobody would buy Treasury bonds if the Fed were selling. So the government was still pumping out inflation. In fact, it was getting worse, going from a $1.4 trillion deficit in 2022 to $1.8 trillion in 2024. But the rate hikes that were hiding that inflation had stopped. In raw numbers, that means from October of 2022, the money supply shrank by $700 billion, about 3.5%, which brought inflation down from 8% to 3%. But in the past year, that flipped to growth of $600 billion in money, which is why inflation stopped falling. In fact, it is picking up again. Then, to put a cherry on it, Powell actually cut rates starting in September, which is bizarre since inflation was running hot. Why did Jerome lower rates when inflation was so far above target? One reason might be to save the banks, which were blindsided by the Fed's rate hikes. Hikes make bonds worth less, and U.S. banks are sitting on trillions of U.S. Treasury bonds. Another reason, of course, is that there was an election to buy, and rate cuts give you that pleasing tissue fire that was supposed to haul cackles over the line. So what's next? Brought to you by Unchained.com. Given the inflation bomb they're handing to Trump, he will need to either massively cut federal spending or massively grow the economy. This is because inflation is fundamentally how much money is chasing how much stuff. So either reduce the money, government spending, or increase the stuff, economic growth. As for the Fed, odds actually rose of a rate cut at the next meeting, suggesting markets expected even worse inflation, but figured Jerome's the kind of guy who does inflationary cuts when inflation is rising. This is concerning because if you overlay a chart of Bidenflation, the peak and the current zombie resurgence, it looks eerily similar to the 1970s, where inflation got a second wind that ended up worse than the first and lasted nearly 5 years with double-digit inflation and double-digit unemployment. So Donald Trump has his work cut out for him. Okay, we'll be watching. See you next time.